The setting is mid-18th century France, and my main character is Anne Marguerite Durand III. She's in a desperate situation. Now, she has done some great things in her young life before, but even this seems like it's too much to bear. On the evening of July 13th, 1788, Anne's dream world was torn apart by a terrible crash. She jolted awake and up. Had she been having a nightmare? Is this a nightmare? She was damp. Perhaps her thoughts were off, linking the realms of consciousness and the dream state together. Stuck somewhere between incoherent world of the imagination and the harsh reality of life. While her thoughts swam adrift, there were more crashes, thudding and pounding like an angry man at the door. Yet, this was on her sturdy stone roof. Booming noises demanding her brain be fully present in the moment. Her senses didn't know what to make of it. She was chilled and the air seemed heavy, yet it was midsummer. Soon her babies were crying out for her in the dark, noisy night. She struggled to get her lantern lit and comfort her crying children. Anne's next thoughts turned to her husband's bakery. He would be downstairs by now, preparing the dough for today's townspeople. For weeks they'd been lining up for hours at a time to buy what little bread he could produce. This waiting, this stealing time away from their own labors, just to prolong their seemingly inevitable starvation. She was convinced that the hungry people of her town had turned to violence. Was she under attack? Were they now throwing stones at her home? Why in the world in the middle of the night? Perhaps they were possessed with starving hallucinations. Okay, it is time for clue number 1. Water. Perhaps our mystery plant is thirsty. Thankfully, Anne was not under attack from the townspeople. No, Anne was under attack from a violent and devastating hailstorm. In fact, during the night of July 13th, 1788, another townsman named Arthur Young reported in his journal that hail fell as large as a quart bottle, killing people, macerating crops, and destroying trees, and no doubt wreaking havoc on Anne's stone roof. Anne gathered her children and they rushed below to the safety of the bakery. They waited out the storm in the warm kitchen. They were lucky. But what would be left of the town come morning? While they waited, their thoughts were filled with memories, utterly baffled by this midsummer storm. Anne and her husband Huguet recounted strangeness of weather which had pretty much dominated their childhood. When they were young children, the drought had terribly affected the region. Wheat harvests failed year after year, and what little wheat that did grow could no longer be ground into flour because the surviving, trickling stream that was once a mighty flowing river could no longer push the wheels to grind the grains. For generations, their families had been in the Meteor's company of bakers, but now they were nearly peasants. When Anne was a small child, she was fortunate that her grandmother had the noble family, the Lafayettes, as their regular patrons. They were kind and well-known Parisian aristocrats. They could always afford to buy wheat from somewhere, and father would bake bread especially for them. Anne's father would often secretly keep a loaf of this bespoken bread for Anne and to feed his precious little family. On many occasions during Anne's childhood, Anne accompanied her mother and grandmother to help the housemen of the Lafayettes prepare a large feast for visiting guests. Men from the American colonies were often in attendance. These nobles enjoyed a bounty of food that was off limits to Anne's social status. Her family's social class was forced to harvest from trees and marshes to survive during the food shortages caused by the droughts. The Durand women were caretakers of their community. They used their family knowledge to bring healing plants to the people in need. All these years later, now it was time for Anne to care for her aging mother, even through this terrible storm. Okay, it's time for clue number 2. Coffee mug that says Althea. I love coffee mugs. When daylight pierced through the clouds of dawn, Anne and Huguet were greeted to utter destruction of their town. Ice the size of bricks had fallen from the sky and killed many beasts and crops in the ground. Yet, they pressed on with what little wheat they could get. Cold weeks turned into cold, cold months. Anne and her family managed to hang on to life with their knowledge of foraging wild roots that most would not eat, and knowing where to find vines that were too thin to care about the dangers of falling ice. The winter that followed that year was one of the worst in France's history. In 1788 to 89, from late November to March, much of her town suffered from constant freezing and snow. In fact, in the more southern Paris, there were 57 straight days of frost. It's said that in Paris, barrels of wine turned into slush. Not even strong spirits could warm their bodies. Soon Anne and Huguet found their bakery a place of refuge for many of the townspeople. With the wheat gone, he was no longer baking bread, yet he kept his fires running and warming anyone who came in with anything they could burn. People brought in twigs, and books, and furniture, anything to keep the flames alive. Their cellars were nearly bare by the end of winter, yet the rich people in Paris still feasted on pheasants and fowls. Time for clue number 3. Looks like some roots, maybe. When the cold snap broke in late January and February of 1789, the thawing ice and snow caused rivers and streams and canals to swell and burst their banks, turning struggling riverside crops into mush. Yet for all the misery and all the countryside, Paris still demanded to be fed. Anne and her people were desperate. Even in Paris, rebellion was in the air. The rich were importing cereals and grains from distant countries. They enjoyed their feasts while the countrymen starved. And the nobles knew not the pains of hunger, for their money kept their cellars full. One evening in the early season, the sun was heavy in the sky, and the chill of the night had not set in. Anne's mother brought her a small box from a trunk, and she recognized this box immediately. It was her grandmother's old recipes. She sat astonished to see that some of these were nearly 50 years old. It seemed like yesterday that she was at her side, mixing and mashing. Anne sorted through many of the loose papers, and she was looking for dishes that would fit their humble provisions that they had that day, when she found the answer to her prayers. Let's stop and do clue number 4. Cough drops? Interesting. Now this recipe has its roots a long way back. Anne didn't know it at the time, but even the ancient Egyptians, Persians, and Chinese had a similar version. However, it was her clever grandmother all those years ago who changed it for the world. She combined her plant and culinary knowledge into a recipe that would finally put food on the table for the Durands and her desperate town. The best part about this recipe? The secret ingredient was now growing abundantly in the soggy fields too wet for men to plow. Marshland. Has anyone guessed the plant yet? The next morning, Anne and her mother set the plan into motion. They traveled into Paris to visit their family friend Marquis de Lafayette. While he was born and inherited his father's noble ancestry, he was a man of the people. He fought alongside the Americans in their revolution, and he supported religious freedoms and wanted to abolish slavery. Anne was confident that he would help them. And when Marquis came to the door, he had indeed remembered when Anne Marguerite Durand II had cooked for him as a boy. But this visit was more than a social call. They were not there to catch up. No, they were there as entrepreneurs and looking for an investor. Anne the senior reminded him of the sweet treat that she would sometimes prepare when he was a boy, pâté gémeaux. He searched his memory for just a moment before a warm smile came to his face. Now he remembered that fluffy, stretchy pile of sweet clouds. She would always sneak him a serving or two. They were unlike anything the home confectioners could make him. Anne proposed she could bring these unique clouds to his next dinner party for free. He could impress his guests with such rarities if he would supply 5 pounds of sugars and 3 dozen eggs, and be allowed to take orders should his guests request more for themselves. All right, time for the last clue. Marshmallow? It turns out that Anne Marguerite Durand I had discovered long ago that the well-established herbal remedy for cough, the powerful, partially dried sap from the roots of a marshmallow bush, would turn from a gooey mess into a lozenge if she folded them over and over onto itself, similar to the way that saltwater taffy is made. But then, instead of this tough, chewy finish, she experimented with beating it and folding in egg whites and sugar to the sappy mess the way she would with a meringue, relentlessly mixing it until it was the color of milk. Then she would scoop it all out on a board and leave it for a day. Sure, the process took a total of 4 full days of complicated labor and culinary timing to produce, but this sweet treat was like nothing anyone had ever experienced. And that, my friends, is how the marshmallow was born. From sap to fluff. Yes, Marquis and his guests did in fact enjoy these novel, light, and chewy confections. By the night's end, the Durands were in business. Anne Marguerite Durand III gathered many of her local women and headed to the banks of the flooded fields. They got to work harvesting the marshmallow roots. They were dried in bulk and boiled to release their sap, then beaten with eggs and sugar just like the way her grandmother did it, to form soft, foamy peaks. Finally, they dried them out, cut them, powdered them, packaged, and took them to the homes of the nobles for a very hefty price, turning Anne's marshmallow land into confectionery gold. Let's do a quick rundown of these clues and see how they came along with the story. The first clue. During the mid-1700s, extreme weather events were greatly affecting Northern Europe, including severe droughts and then flooding storms. The people of France were forced to turn to root sources for nutrition. The marshmallow grew wildly by the flooding riverbanks. Indeed, and it does require a lot of water to survive. It's a thirsty plant. Clue number 2. Althena officinalis is the Latin name for marshmallow. In Greek, Althena means healer. So if you're a super plant fan, then you knew it would be in the mallow family. But if you're a Grateful Dead fan, then you're probably just very confused. Clue number 3. Many marshy plants were consumed during these historical times, including the ever-popular marshmallow, which have dominated France's riverbanks. Typically, the roots were dried out and chewed on for their dense nutritious value. After all, these plants concentrate most of their molecules in the root structure to feed the rest of the plants. In clue number 4, the dried roots were a very popular cough suppressant during these times, and for the past several thousand years before that. Chewing on the marshmallow roots were the original cough drops. Clue number 5, duh, the marshmallow. But today's version is clearly not made with marshmallow root sap. Instead, gelatin and sugar are combined and whipped until forming the familiar marshmallow form. The journey from Anne's family to today's modern form took several twists and turns over the past 300 years, with demand and technology driving these adaptations. So that is how the sappy root of the marshmallow took this plant from medicine to candy. But wait, what can marshmallow root do for your skin? Well, first of all, the name says a lot about this plant. It's a mallow plant. It grows best in marshes. It needs and likes a lot of water, like we talked about. But because of this, the roots are sappy, and the leaves are soft, and the flowers are delicate. Everything about this plant oozes moisture, and that is exactly what it will do for our skin. Marshmallow root is an excellent moisturizer, but that is not its plant chemistry bonus. Here is the scientific explanation of its plant chemistry bonus. I shall quote it first and then explain after. The extract of the root of the marshmallow stimulates phagocytosis, then the release of oxygen radicals and leukotrienes from the human neutrophils. This in turn cascades the release of interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor, thus demonstrating their powerful mechanism of action for anti-inflammatory activity. Let me translate. Not only is marshmallow extract fabulous moisturizer, it's also highly anti-inflammatory and has cellular DNA supportive chemistry, meaning it can help heal the damaged skin cells themselves. This occurs through that step process of cellular release that I just mentioned. In fact, one really cool study found that marshmallow root extract could be a great tool to use for people battling UV-induced skin cancer. I could really use some of that. In this study, they grew some human skin cells in petri dishes. I just hate when they do that, it always makes me visualize it. Then they exposed them to UV radiation. Some of the skin cells were treated with aloe, some were treated with marshmallow, and some were treated with evening primrose. Interesting. Well, all three plants helped reduce the amount of inflammation of these skin cells versus the ones that didn't have any intervention. Only the ones treated with marshmallow extract had DNA protective properties, meaning it could potentially be used to help prevent skin cancer in those after direct sun exposure. Oh, now I bet you want to know, am I formulating with marshmallow root extract? Well, not currently, but now after learning all of the super cool plant chemistry, I think I can find it a home amongst my ingredients. Stay tuned for updates in that in the future. I hope you enjoyed the story of female perseverance, cleverness, entrepreneurship, and herbalism. While many of the historical events were accurate, including the weather, the Lafayettes, and the invention and rise of popularity of the marshmallow treats, unfortunately Anne and her family are just merely fictional characters. Dehydrated marshmallow root has been used for thousands of years as a cough suppressant, then turned candy, and again reinvented to be useful in skincare. Guess what else? There's another plant root that follows this same path. Cough suppressant to candy to skincare. Check out this video about licorice root and see how the whole thing came about.